This 1889 portrait seemed innocent until you saw where his hand rests. Dr. Michael Hayes had spent 23 years studying 19th century American photography, and he thought he'd seen everything. On a humid Tuesday morning in August, he sat in the climate-controlled basement of the Charleston Historical Society, methodically cataloging a recently donated collection of daguerreotypes and cabinet cards. The air smelled of old paper and preservation chemicals, a scent he'd grown to love over the decades. Outside, the South Carolina heat shimmered off the streets, but down here, surrounded by history, the temperature remained a constant 68 degrees. The photograph that would change everything appeared unremarkable at first, just another formal studio portrait from 1889. A white man in his early 30s stood beside a black woman who looked to be in her mid to late 20s. Both were dressed formally. He wore a dark suit with a high collar and watch chain. She wore a simple but well-made dress with modest trim and a high neckline. The backdrop was typical of the era, a painted garden scene that probably adorned 1,000 studios across the South. The photographer's mark was barely visible in the corner. Fletcher and Sons, Charleston. Michael almost set it aside without a second glance. Studio portraits of this type were common, though interracial photographs were relatively rare for the period. He made a note in his catalog: mixed-race studio portrait, circa 1889, Charleston area, unknown subjects, Fletcher Studio. His hand hovered over the next photograph in the stack, but something made him look again. The composition felt off somehow. The man's posture was stiff, almost proprietary. He stood slightly behind the woman, his body angled toward her in a way that seemed to claim rather than accompany. The woman's face, there was something in her expression that didn't match the formal neutrality typical of Victorian portraiture. Michael reached for his magnifying glass, the same one his mentor had given him when he'd started graduate school 3 decades earlier. He leaned closer, studying the woman's eyes first. Even through the grain of the albumin print, he could see tension in her features. Her jaw was set too tightly. Her eyes looked past the camera rather than at it, a slight downward cast that suggested she was trying to be anywhere but in that studio. There were shadows under her eyes, and her mouth was pressed into a thin line that could never be mistaken for a smile. Then Michael's gaze traveled down to where their bodies met in the frame. His breath caught in his throat. The man's right hand rested on the woman's left thigh, not casually beside her, but gripping it with clear possession. The fabric of her dress showed the slight bunching where his fingers pressed into her leg. Michael's stomach tightened as he noticed how the woman's left hand was clenched into a fist at her side, knuckles white even in the faded photograph. Her other hand gripped the arm of the chair she sat in, fingers digging into the upholstery. This wasn't a portrait of friends, or even employer and employee. This was something much darker. Michael set down his magnifying glass and removed his reading glasses, rubbing his eyes. In all his years studying these images, documenting the lives captured in old photographs, he'd never seen something quite like this. Evidence of coercion, of abuse, frozen in a formal studio portrait. Someone had paid good money to have this photograph taken. Someone had looked through the camera lens and pressed the shutter anyway. He picked up the photograph again with gloved hands, turning it over carefully. On the back, in faded pencil, someone had written, J.W. and Claudia, March 1889. Just 2 names, a date, and a century of silence. Michael couldn't stop thinking about the photograph. That evening he sat at his kitchen table in his Mount Pleasant apartment, the image scanned and displayed on his laptop screen. He'd enlarged it to examine every detail, and each new viewing made his stomach turn. The woman's expression haunted him, that mixture of fear and resignation that spoke of something endured rather than chosen. He opened a new document and began typing notes. J.W. could be dozens of men in Charleston in 1889. The city directories from that era were extensive but incomplete. Claudia's last name wasn't provided, which wasn't unusual for black individuals in photographs from this period. Their identities were often considered less important, their stories deemed unworthy of full documentation. Michael picked up his phone and called his colleague, Dr. Patricia Marshall, who specialized in post-Reconstruction African-American history at the College of Charleston. She answered on the 3rd ring, her voice warm but curious about the late call. Patricia, I found something today, Michael said. A photograph from 1889. I need your help understanding what I'm looking at. He described the image in detail, the hand placement, the woman's expression, the formal studio setting. There was a long pause on the other end of the line. Send me the image, Patricia said, her tone shifting to something more serious. Michael, you might be looking at documentation of sexual abuse. In 1889, a black woman working in a white household would have had virtually no legal recourse, no protection. If this man was her employer, that's what I'm afraid of, Michael interrupted. But why would someone photograph it? Why document it so explicitly? Power, Patricia said simply. Possession. In that era, some white men didn't just abuse black women, they flaunted it. It was a demonstration of complete control. The photograph itself might have been a form of psychological dominance, forcing her to participate in creating a permanent record of his ownership over her body. Michael felt sick. He looked at the image again, at Claudia's clenched fists and averted eyes. "I need to find out who she was," he said. "She deserves to have her story told, to have someone acknowledge what happened to her." "Then we start with the photographer," Patricia replied. "Fletcher and Sons. Studio photographers kept detailed records, appointment books, client ledgers. If we can find those archives, we might be able to identify J.W. and trace him to an address. From there, we can search census records, city directories, property deeds." Michael was already typing notes. "The Charleston Historical Society might have Fletcher's business records. I'll check first thing tomorrow morning." "I'll meet you there," Patricia said. "Michael, this is important work, but prepare yourself. What we find might be worse than what's in that photograph." After they hung up, Michael sat in the quiet of his apartment, staring at the image. Claudia looked back at him across 135 years, her silent testimony waiting to finally be heard. The next morning, Michael and Patricia stood in the archives room of the Charleston Historical Society, surrounded by leather-bound ledgers and boxes of business documents. The archivist, an elderly man named Robert Chen, had directed them to the Fletcher and Sons collection, 3 decades of studio records meticulously preserved by the photographer's great-granddaughter before her death in 2003. "March 1889, Michael muttered, carefully turning the fragile pages of the appointment book. His cotton gloves made the work slow and delicate. Patricia stood beside him, photographing each page with her phone for their records. The entries were written in elegant cursive, each appointment noting the date, client name, type of photograph, and payment received. Michael's finger traced down the March entries: family portraits, wedding photographs, memorial pictures of deceased children, a common and heartbreaking practice of the era. Then he found it. March 14th, 1889. J. Whitmore. Single portrait with household staff, cabinet card, $2.50, paid in full. J. Whitmore, Patricia repeated, already pulling out her tablet. And notice how it's phrased with household staff, not and household staff. She wasn't a co-subject. She was a prop. Michael felt anger rising in his chest. He photographed the entry, making sure every word was clearly captured. Now we find out who J. Whitmore was. Patricia was already searching the 1890 census records on her tablet. Whitmore isn't a common name in Charleston. There are only 3 J. Whitmores listed in the city in 1890. She scrolled through the entries. James Whitmore, age 67, retired merchant. Joseph Whitmore, age 19, clerk. And, she paused, Jonathan Whitmore, age 31, listed as commission merchant, living on Meeting Street. Age matches, Michael said. 31 in 1890 means he'd have been 30 in 1889 when the photograph was taken. Patricia continued reading. He's listed as head of household. Wife Martha, age 28, 2 children under 5, and... She looked up at Michael, her expression grim. 3 servants, all listed as black, all women. No names given, just ages 26, 34, and 52. 26 years old, Michael said quietly. Claudia would have been around 25 or 26 in that photograph. They spent the next hour pulling every record they could find on Jonathan Whitmore. City directories confirmed his address, a large townhouse on Meeting Street, in what was then one of Charleston's most prestigious neighborhoods. Tax records showed he owned considerable property. Newspaper archives revealed he was a cotton commission merchant, facilitating sales between plantations and northern textile mills, a lucrative business built on the legacy of slavery. He was wealthy, Patricia observed, reading through a society page from 1888 that mentioned a dinner party the Whitmores had hosted. Well-connected. His wife came from one of the old Charleston families. Michael found something else, a business advertisement from 1889. Look at this. J. Whitmore and Associates, commission merchants, honest dealings and fair prices. The hypocrisy is staggering. That was the era, Patricia said. Men like Whitmore attended church on Sunday, presented themselves as pillars of the community, and brutalized the women who worked in their homes, and society protected them, not their victims. Michael turned back to the photograph on his laptop. Now he could put a full name to the man, Jonathan Whitmore, respected merchant, family man, abuser. But Claudia remained only a first name, one of 3 unnamed black women listed as servants in a census document. We need to find out who she really was, Michael said. Her full name, where she came from, what happened to her after this photograph was taken. Patricia nodded. Church records. Black churches kept detailed membership rolls. If Claudia attended church in Charleston, there might be records. We should also check hospital records, property deeds, anything that might have her full name. They were giving a voice to someone history had tried to silence, and they were just beginning. 3 days later, Michael and Patricia sat in the small office of Emmanuel AME Church on Calhoun Street, one of the oldest black churches in Charleston. Reverend David Thomas, a man in his 60s with kind eyes and graying hair, had welcomed them warmly and brought out boxes of century-old records stored in the church's climate-controlled vault. "We've maintained our membership records since 1865, Reverend Thomas explained, carefully placing a leather-bound book on the table. After emancipation, many formerly enslaved people came to our church seeking community and documentation of their freedom. We recorded births, deaths, marriages, all the life events that had never been officially recognized during slavery." Patricia opened the book carefully. The pages were filled with names, dates, and brief notations in various hands, some elegant, some barely legible. She turned to the entries from 1889 and began scanning the names. Michael watched over her shoulder, hoping to see Claudia appear somewhere on these pages. "Here," Patricia said suddenly, her finger stopping on an entry. "Claudia Freeman, baptized March 24th, 1889. Age given as 26. Former residence listed as Whitmore Household, Meeting Street." Michael felt his pulse quicken. 10 days after the photograph was taken, she was baptized 10 days later. Reverend Thomas leaned forward to look at the entry. "That's significant. Baptism in our tradition represents a new beginning, a washing away of the past. For someone to seek baptism specifically after leaving an employer..." He trailed off, the implication clear. "Is there anything else about her in the records?" Michael asked. Patricia turned pages carefully, searching through the rest of 1889 and into 1890. Finally, she found another entry. "Marriage record, June 2nd, 1889. Claudia Freeman married to Samuel Freeman, both residing at..." She looked up, surprised. "The same address? They had the same last name before marriage?" "Freeman was a common surname adopted by formerly enslaved people after emancipation," Reverend Thomas explained. "It's possible they were brother and sister or cousins, who simply chose the same surname independently. The marriage could have been a form of protection. A married woman had slightly more legal standing than an unmarried one, even if only marginally." Michael made notes frantically. "Do we have any record of Samuel Freeman? Anything about what he did, where he worked?" They searched for another hour, finding scattered mentions of the Freemans in church records. Samuel Freeman appeared in a notation from 1890 as a carpenter working on repairs to the church building. Another entry from 1891 listed him as a member of the church's Mutual Aid Society, a group that helped black community members in times of need. Then Patricia found something that made her pause. Death record. Claudia Freeman. Died September 18th, 1895. Age 32. Cause of death. Complications from childbirth. The room fell silent. Michael stared at the entry, calculating. She'd lived only 6 years after that photograph was taken. 6 years after escaping Jonathan Whitmore's household. She'd been only 32 years old. "Is there a record of the child?" he asked quietly. Patricia scanned the pages. "Yes, daughter born September 17th, 1895. Name, Grace Freeman. There's a note that she survived, placed in the care of her father and grandmother." "Grace would have been 130 years old now if she'd lived a full life," Michael said. "But her descendants might still be in Charleston. If we can trace the Freeman family forward..." Reverend Thomas nodded. "I know several Freeman families in our congregation. It's a common name, as I mentioned, but I can ask around. If Grace Freeman married and had children, there could be great-great-grandchildren living in Charleston today who don't even know their ancestor's story." Michael looked at Patricia. "We need to find them. Claudia's descendants deserve to know what she survived, what she escaped from. And they deserve to see that photograph, not as a document of shame, but as evidence of her courage in leaving." "I'll start making inquiries," Reverend Thomas said. "Give me a few days. Our community has long memories, and family stories get passed down, even if all the details are lost over time." As they left the church that afternoon, Michael felt both heartened and heartbroken. They'd found Claudia's full name, traced her life after the photograph, and discovered she'd found some measure of freedom and love. But she died so young, and her suffering had been so invisibly woven into the fabric of Charleston's history. While waiting to hear back from Reverend Thomas, Michael decided to investigate Jonathan Whitmore's life more thoroughly. If Claudia's story was one of survival, Whitmore's was one of privilege and impunity. Understanding the full scope of his position in Charleston society might reveal more about the power dynamics that had allowed the abuse to happen. Michael drove to Meeting Street, following the historical address he'd found in the city directories. The neighborhood had changed over 135 years, but many of the antebellum and Victorian homes still stood, meticulously preserved by their current owners. He parked across from number 284, the former Whitmore residence. It was a 3-story townhouse with elegant ironwork balconies and tall windows, painted a soft gray with white trim. A historical marker near the front gate identified it as the Whitmore Caldwell House, circa 1850, noting its architectural significance. The marker mentioned Jonathan Whitmore as a prominent merchant who had lived there from 1885 to 1902, but said nothing about the people who had worked there, the lives lived in its kitchen and servant quarters. Michael took photographs documenting the building's facade. He noticed a woman in her 50s tending to flower boxes on the front porch and approached the gate. "Excuse me," he called. "I'm Dr. Michael Hayes, a historian. I'm researching the Whitmore family who lived here in the 1880s and 90s. Would you be willing to answer a few questions?" The woman looked up, her expression friendly but curious. She walked to the gate. "I'm Ann Caldwell. My husband's family has owned this house since 1903. What kind of research are you doing?" "I'm studying household dynamics in post-Reconstruction Charleston," Michael said carefully, "particularly the experiences of domestic workers. I've found records indicating that 3 black women worked in this house during Jonathan Whitmore's residence." Ann's expression shifted slightly, becoming more serious. "Come in. I've actually found some things over the years that might interest you." She led him through an elegant entrance hall and into a sitting room filled with antique furniture. "When we renovated the kitchen 10 years ago, we found a space beneath the floorboards in what used to be the servant quarters. There were some items hidden there, letters, a few small personal objects. We've kept them, not sure what to do with them." Michael's heart raced. "May I see them?" Anne left and returned with a wooden box. Inside were several folded letters, brittle with age, and a few small objects: a tarnished thimble, a broken hair comb, and a small fabric doll, handmade and worn. Michael carefully unfolded one of the letters. The handwriting was rough, unpracticed, but legible. "Dear Samuel, I pray this finds you. Mr. W. has gone to Atlanta for business 3 days. This is my chance. Meet me at the church Tuesday night after dark. I cannot stay here no more. He will not let me be. Please come. Your loving Claudia." Michael's hands trembled as he read. This was Claudia's own words, her own hand. The letter was undated, but if Samuel had received it, they must have arranged her escape together. "There are 4 more letters," Anne said quietly, "all from someone named Claudia to someone named Samuel. We found them hidden in what must have been her room. I always wondered who she was and what she was running from." Michael explained what he'd discovered: the photograph, the church records, Claudia's baptism and marriage shortly after leaving the Whitmore household. He didn't show Anne the photograph itself, not yet, but he described its disturbing content. Anne sat down heavily. "That poor woman, living in this house, suffering God knows what, and no one to help her." "She helped herself," Michael said. "She planned her escape, reached out to someone she trusted, and got out. These letters are evidence of her agency, her determination to survive." He photographed each letter carefully, then asked, "Did you find any records from the Whitmore family themselves? Diaries, household accounts, anything?" Anne shook her head. "When my husband's grandfather bought the house in 1903, most of the Whitmore possessions had already been removed. Jonathan Whitmore died in 1902, and his widow sold the property and moved to Columbia." Michael made notes. Whitmore had lived 17 more years after that photograph, dying at age 51. He'd never faced consequences for his actions, never been held accountable. But Claudia had found freedom, married, started a new life. And now, 130 years later, her words had been discovered, her story was being told. 2 weeks after meeting with Reverend Thomas, Michael received a phone call that changed everything. A woman named Denise Freeman had reached out to the church, saying her great-great-grandmother had been named Grace Freeman, daughter of Claudia and Samuel Freeman. Michael and Patricia arranged to meet Denise at a coffee shop in North Charleston. She arrived carrying a worn photo album and a manila envelope, her expression a mixture of curiosity and apprehension. She was in her early 40s, with warm brown eyes and her hair pulled back in a neat bun. "Reverend Thomas said you've been researching my family," she said as they sat down. "I've always wanted to know more about my ancestors, but the records are so sparse. My grandmother told me stories, but she didn't know much herself." Michael chose his words carefully. "We found some information about your great-great-grandmother, Claudia Freeman, but I need to warn you, some of what we've discovered is difficult. It involves abuse she suffered while working as a domestic servant in 1889. Denise's expression grew serious. "Tell me. She's my ancestor. I want to know her truth, not a sanitized version." Michael showed her the photograph. Denise stared at it for a long moment, her eyes filling with tears. "That's her? That's Claudia?" She looked at the man's hand on Claudia's thigh, at her great-great-grandmother's clenched fists and anguished expression. Oh, God, what that man was doing to her. "She escaped," Patricia said gently. "She left the Whitmore household, married Samuel Freeman, and was baptized at Emmanuel AME Church. She found freedom and love, even after everything she endured." Denise wiped her eyes. "My grandmother used to say that our family came from strong women who survived terrible things. I never knew the details. She just said we came from people who refused to be broken." Michael showed her the letters they'd found hidden beneath the floorboards. Denise read them slowly, her fingers tracing the words her ancestor had written 135 years ago. "This is her handwriting," she whispered. "Her actual words. I've never seen anything like this from anyone in my family that far back." She opened the photo album she'd brought. "This is the only photograph I have that might be related. My grandmother said it was Grace Freeman, Claudia's daughter, taken around 1920. The photograph showed a dignified woman in her mid-20s, standing beside a church building. She had Claudia's eyes, the same strong jawline. Grace lived until 1968, Denise said. She had 5 children, and one of them was my grandfather. She worked as a seamstress and was very active in the church. My grandmother said Grace never talked much about her mother, only that Claudia had died when Grace was a baby, and that she'd been raised by her father Samuel and her grandmother." Michael pulled out his notes. "We found records showing Samuel continued to live in Charleston, working as a carpenter. He never remarried. He raised Grace with the help of his mother until she was grown. He must have loved Claudia very much," Denise said quietly. "To help her escape like that, to marry her and protect her, and then to honor her memory by raising their daughter alone." Patricia leaned forward. "Denise, we'd like to tell Claudia's story publicly, with your permission, not to sensationalize what she suffered, but to document her courage and resistance. Stories like hers have been erased from history for too long." Denise nodded, wiping her eyes again. "Yes, tell her story. She deserves to be remembered not as a victim, but as a survivor. As a woman who refused to accept what that man was doing to her and found a way out." She looked at the photograph again, at Claudia's face. "I see her strength now, not just her fear. She's looking past the camera because she was already planning her escape. She was already thinking about freedom." Michael felt a chill run down his spine. Denise was right. In that moment captured in March 1889, Claudia had already been writing letters to Samuel, already planning to leave. The photograph documented not just her suffering, but the beginning of her liberation. "There's one more thing," Denise said, pulling a small object from the manila envelope. "My grandmother gave this to me before she died. She said it had been passed down from Grace, who got it from her grandmother, Samuel's mother. It was a small silver locket, tarnished with age." Denise opened it carefully. Inside were 2 tiny photographs, barely an inch across. One showed a young black man with kind eyes, Samuel Freeman. The other showed Claudia, but not the Claudia from the Whitmore photograph. This Claudia was smiling, genuinely smiling, her eyes bright with joy. "This must have been taken after they married," Patricia said softly. "Look at the difference in her expression." It was like looking at 2 different people. The Claudia in the Whitmore photograph was trapped, terrified, enduring. The Claudia in the locket was free, loved, alive. "This is how I want people to remember her," Denise said, not just as someone who suffered, but as someone who survived and found happiness, even if it was too brief. Michael spent the next 3 weeks preparing a presentation for the Southern Historical Association's annual conference. With Denise's permission, he would unveil Claudia's story to the academic community and argue for a broader re-examination of photographic evidence from the post-Reconstruction era. The night before his presentation, he sat in his hotel room in Atlanta, reviewing his slides one final time. The presentation included the Whitmore photograph, blurred slightly to protect its sensitive nature, alongside the locket photograph of Claudia smiling. The contrast was stark and powerful. Patricia called to check on him. "Are you ready?" "I think so," Michael said. "I'm nervous about the response. Some historians might argue I'm reading too much into a single image." "You have documentation," Patricia reminded him. "The letters, the church records, the census data, Denise's family testimony. This isn't speculation. This is evidence-based historical research." The next morning, Michael stood before 200 historians, archivists, and graduate students. He began with a question. What can a single photograph tell us about power, abuse, and resistance in the post-Reconstruction South? He showed the Whitmore photograph, explaining what he'd noticed upon close examination. The room fell silent as the audience studied the image projected on the screen. The hand placement, Claudia's expression, her clenched fists. Then he told her story. The escape, the baptism, the marriage, the letters hidden beneath floorboards. He showed Grace's photograph, and finally, the locket image of Claudia smiling. Claudia Freeman's story was almost lost, Michael concluded. She was rendered nameless in census records, invisible in historical narratives, reduced to household staff in a photographer's ledger. But she left traces, in church records and letters and the memories passed down through her descendants. And those traces tell us something crucial. These women were not passive victims. They resisted, they escaped, they built new lives. Our job as historians is to find these stories and give them the prominence they deserve. The applause was immediate and sustained. During the question period, several historians shared similar photographs they'd encountered, images that hinted at abuse or coercion but had never been fully investigated. After the presentation, a curator from the Smithsonian approached Michael. We'd like to feature Claudia's story in our upcoming exhibition on domestic labor in America. Would you and the Freeman family be willing to participate? Michael promised to ask Denise. As he left the conference hall, he felt both exhausted and energized. Claudia's story was no longer hidden. It would now be part of the permanent historical record. The conference presentation sparked unexpected responses. Within 2 weeks, Michael received emails from archivists, historians, and private collectors across the South, sharing photographs that showed similar disturbing dynamics. In nearly every case, the images depicted white men and black women in poses that suggested coercion or abuse, yet had been cataloged as innocent household portraits. One archivist in Virginia sent a photograph dated 1887, showing a plantation owner with his hand gripping the arm of a young black woman whose expression mirrored Claudia's. Another collector in Georgia shared an 1891 image with nearly identical composition to the Whitmore photograph. Michael and Patricia began documenting these cases, creating a database. They discovered a pattern. Most photographs had been taken in professional studios, suggesting the men wanted formal documentation of their control. The women in the images were rarely identified by name in any accompanying records. "This wasn't isolated," Patricia said during one of their research sessions. "This was systemic, and the photography studios participated by facilitating it." They decided to research Fletcher and Sons more thoroughly. Going through the studio's complete records, they found 3 other appointments where Jonathan Whitmore had brought household staff for portraits between 1887 and 1895. They requested those images from the Historical Society's collection. When the photographs arrived, Michael felt sick. They showed different women, likely the other servants listed in the census, in similarly compromising poses with Whitmore. The pattern of abuse was clear and documented. He was creating a record of his power, Patricia said grimly. Each photograph was a way of asserting ownership, of humiliating these women even further by making their subjugation permanent and visible. One photograph showed an older woman, around 50, who might have been the 3rd servant from the census. Unlike the others, she stared directly at the camera, her expression not fearful but defiant. Michael wondered what her story had been, whether she too had escaped. They reached out to more black churches in Charleston, searching for records of women who had worked in the Whitmore household. They found 2 more names, Ruth and Elizabeth, both with the surname Freeman, again, likely a name chosen after emancipation. Both had been baptized at Emmanuel AME Church in 1890, 1 year after Claudia. The evidence suggested that Claudia's escape might have inspired others to leave as well. 6 months later, the Smithsonian's National Museum of American History opened its exhibition, Unseen: Domestic Workers in the Photography of Power, 1865-1920. Claudia Freeman's story formed the centerpiece, with her 2 photographs, the Whitmore portrait and the Lockett image, displayed side by side. Michael and Patricia stood in the gallery on opening day, watching visitors move through the exhibition. Denise had flown in from Charleston with her family, including her teenage daughter, who stared intently at her ancestors' images. The exhibition didn't shy away from the disturbing content. Explicit labels explained what the photographs documented: sexual abuse, coercion, and the exploitation of black women who had virtually no legal protection in the post-Reconstruction South. But the exhibition also emphasized resistance and survival, showing how women like Claudia had found ways to escape, build communities, and reclaim their dignity. Visitors lingered longest at Claudia's Lockett photograph, where she smiled freely. Many were visibly moved, some wiping tears as they read about her escape and brief years of freedom. A journalist from the Washington Post interviewed Denise for an article about the exhibition. "What do you want people to understand about your great-great-grandmother?" the journalist asked. "That she was a real person with agency and strength," Denise answered. "She lived in a system designed to destroy her, but she found a way out. She loved and was loved. She had a daughter who carried her memory forward. That matters." The article was published the following week, and Claudia's story went viral on social media. Thousands of people shared the images, particularly the contrast between the 2 photographs. Many black women wrote about their own ancestors' stories of survival, creating an online archive of testimonies that had been passed down through generations but never publicly documented. Michael watched the response with a mixture of pride and humility. He'd simply noticed a detail in an old photograph, but the story had touched something deep in the collective consciousness, a recognition of pain long ignored and strength long unacknowledged. The exhibition traveled to museums in Atlanta, Charleston, and New Orleans over the following year, each time drawing large crowds and emotional responses. 2 years after finding the photograph, Michael returned to Charleston for a special ceremony. The city was placing a historical marker at the site where Claudia and Samuel's home had once stood, a small house that had been demolished in the 1950s during urban renewal. The marker read, "Site of the Freeman Home. Claudia Freeman, 1863-1895, and Samuel Freeman, 1862 to 1920, lived here after their marriage in 1889. Claudia escaped abuse as a domestic worker and built a new life dedicated to family and community." Her courage represents the resistance of countless black women whose stories have been erased from official histories. Her daughter, Grace Freeman, 1895-1968, continued her legacy of strength and dignity. Denise stood beside Michael as the marker was unveiled. Her daughter placed flowers at its base. Members of Emmanuel AME Church sang hymns that Claudia would have known. Reverend Thomas, now in his late 60s, offered a prayer. We remember Claudia Freeman not as a victim, but as an ancestor who refused to accept the chains others tried to place on her. We honor her memory by continuing to tell these stories, by insisting that black women's lives and experiences matter, and by working toward a world where such abuse can never happen again. After the ceremony, Michael walked to the Charleston Historical Society one last time. The Whitmore photograph now resided in a special collection dedicated to documenting difficult histories. It would be preserved, studied, and used to educate future generations about the realities of post-Reconstruction America. But Michael thought most often about the Lockett photograph, Claudia's smile, the joy in her eyes. That image, too, was part of the historical record now, a testament to human resilience and the power of love to heal even the deepest wounds. He'd spent his career studying 19th century photography, analyzing composition and chemistry and historical context. But this investigation had taught him something more important. Every photograph contains a human story, and some of those stories need generations to finally be heard. Claudia Freeman had waited 135 years for someone to truly see what that 1889 portrait documented. But now her story would live forever, not just as evidence of suffering, but as proof of courage, survival, and the unbreakable human spirit. As Michael left Charleston that evening, driving north toward home, he thought about all the other photographs, sitting in archives and attics, waiting for someone to look closer, to ask questions, to give voice to the silent testimonies they contained. Claudia's story was one among millions, but it was no longer hidden. And that, Michael thought, was a beginning.